So it's really important that we understand how one impacts the other. So in perfect competition, there would be no barriers to supply and demand, and no one would have the ability to affect prices. That's how perfect competition would look. That's not a reality. So it's important for us to understand how prices can impact supply, how prices can impact demand. In any transaction between a seller and a buyer, the price of goods or services is determined by the supply and demand in the market. If the supply is high, the price is going to go up. The demand eventually will go down at some point. Okay? So basic supply and demand, suppliers will keep producing as long as they can sell the goods for a price that exceeds their cost. As long as they're making money on the product, they will continue to produce that product. Buyers will continue to purchase that product as long as the satisfaction they get from purchasing that exceeds the amount that they are paying for it. Eventually, buyers will stop. When the price gets too high, they'll stop. Okay? And the same is true in the other instance. If the cost to create the product is too high, the suppliers will stop. Okay? Where those two curves intersect, that is called the market clearing price. That's when the suppliers are happy and the buyers are happy. That is called the market clearing price or the equilibrium price. So that's what this is. We're going to use these two terms interchangeably, so it's important that you know them both. So market clearing price, or MCP, that's this dot right here on the curve, or the equilibrium price. That's when everybody's happy, okay? The supply is meeting the demand. Perfect. A supply curve slopes up, a demand curve slopes down. That's also something important to know. Anytime you draw a curve, and I suggest that you do, especially if these shifts start to get confusing, it's really easy to quickly draw a curve to see what you're talking about. Price is always on the y-axis, and quantity is always on the x. Okay? So as you're supplying more, the price is going up. When the price is high, the quantity is low for demand. Okay, but where these two meet, that's the equilibrium price. And that will shift when outside factors impact the curve. So, we'll start with supply. As prices increase, additional suppliers will enter the market. When costs go up, people want to supply more because there's a chance to make money on that product. So more suppliers will enter the market. Supplies will increase until the market clearing price or that equilibrium price is reached. If the price starts to decrease, suppliers will eventually drop out of the market because they're not making money on that product anymore. The quantities suppliers are willing to produce at each price is called the supply curve. So that's what that curve represents. This is how much I'm willing to supply at this price. There are things that will impact the law of supply. So like I said, this is what a supply curve looks like. Every time, that's what it looks like. There's factors that will shift it to the right or to the left, but it's always going to be upward like that. So some things that impact supply. Input costs. So an increase in technology. If it gets cheaper for suppliers to create a product, then they'll create more of it. So an increase in technology will essentially increase the supply because it's cheaper for them to make it. So they're going to create more of it. That's going to shift the curve to the right. That's when we get this shift because the quantity is increasing. I'm going to create more of it. So we get this type of shift. When the curve shifts this way, this equilibrium price goes down. The cost is going down. You see that in the curve? So So that's what I mean by it might be helpful sometimes to draw a chart for yourself, because then you can visually see these shifts. Consumer expectations. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong one. Government influence. So government can influence the supply in these ways. Subsidies are a good thing for suppliers because it encourages them to create more. So the cost to create the product would decrease for the supplier. They're going to end up creating more. So it's going to increase the supply. If we're increasing the supply, we're shifting to the right. An increase in supply shifts the curve to the right, and that decreases our equilibrium cost, or our equilibrium price. Taxes and regulations, however, will make it more expensive for the supplier to supply that product. If it's more expensive, they're going to produce less. That will shift the supply curve to the left, which will increase the equilibrium price. Okay. Future expectation of prices also can impact the supply curve. So for example, if the supplier knows that down the road this product, the cost of it's going to go up, they might hold on to it and decrease their supply until the price goes up and then start to produce more so they can make more money. Okay? So if that happens, you'll shift the curve to the left. We're decreasing the supply, the curve shifts to the left and the equilibrium price goes up. Okay? Another impact on supply is the number of sellers. If there's a bunch of sellers, then the supply is going to go up. That's going to shift the curve to the right and the equilibrium price is going to go down. Okay? So these are the factors that influence supply. This is, I wanted to make sure that we had a visual of just the graph because it's an important one to recognize. Notice the price. If we're shifting supply, if we're increasing our supply, this equilibrium cost is decreasing. And we're shifting to the right.
And the D is the demand?
Yes.
So that just stays in a straight line down?
Yep, that's going to stay. But the equilibrium price is changing. We're going to talk about shifts in demand in a second. Okay? So let's talk about demand. Demand, so buyers tend to purchase more of a product when the prices are lower. I think we have a basic understanding of that. So the demand curve then slopes downward. Demand, D, downward, D, however that helps you remember it, but it's always going down, okay? Because if the price goes up, the supply is gonna go up, the demand for that product is gonna go down. People aren't gonna wanna spend as much money on it. There are some exceptions to the law of demand, however. There are two exceptions. One of the exceptions to the law of demand are called Giffen goods. Giffen goods are necessities. So demand doesn't impact, the cost doesn't impact the demand. So an example of a Giffen good would be something like bread, rice, milk, eggs. Those things that if it was an emergency and we knew we were going to be locked at home forever, we would run to the grocery store and get all the toilet paper, right? We've seen that. So those are Giffen goods. It doesn't matter if you jack up the price of those, people are still going to buy them because they're necessities, okay? Veblen goods, this is named after the person who came up with this idea, is another exception. Those are luxury items. So the cost doesn't impact the demand because it's the cost of them that puts them in demand, okay? It's the designer bag or the designer clothing, the stuff that has the label on it that everyone's like, ooh, you bought that? That's awesome. It creates that sign of prestige. So the fact that it costs more doesn't impact the demand because they are in demand because they're luxury items, like a nice car, things like that would be an example. So those are the two exceptions to the law of demand. Other than that, for the most part, if the cost goes up, people aren't going to want it. The demand will go down. So that's why the demand curve slopes down. But there are some things that impact demand. So for example, income. If your income increases, the demand for goods will increase. An increase in demand shifts the curve to the right. So it's gonna go this way. That's going to increase the equilibrium price. So that's different than when we talked about supply. If we're shifting to the right, that's an increase in demand, that's an increase in the equilibrium price. People are willing to pay more, okay, until they reach this. Then they're like, no thank you, okay? Another thing that impacts demand, consumer expectations. So if consumers are really excited about a product, that's going to increase demand. An increase in demand shifts right, and that increases the equilibrium price. Population. If the population goes up, we are gonna need more products. So demand will also go up. An increase in demand shifts the curve to the right, and there's an increase in the equilibrium price. Consumer taste and advertising also impacts demand. If a company is really great at advertising, consumers are going to want that product. The demand for it's going to increase. An increase in demand shifts the curve to the right and also increases the equilibrium price. Then there's the price of related goods. There are goods that are called complements, so they essentially go together, okay? So like a computer and purchasing software. If you're not gonna purchase a computer, then you're probably not gonna purchase the software and vice versa. Or if you buy a new iPhone and then you wanna get the iPods that go with it. So those are complements. So if there's an increase in the demand for one good, there's gonna be an increase in the demand for the complement of that good as well, okay? An increase in demand increases the equilibrium price. Substitutes, however, this is something that, let's say your favorite ketchup brand, the cost of that keeps going up. Well, you could substitute that with a different brand of ketchup that's a little bit more, that's cheaper. That's a substitute. So for a substitute, an increase in the price can cause an increase in the demand for a different product that you can substitute it for instead. Okay? But any increase in demand is going to shift to the right and increase the equilibrium price. And the opposite is true. If there's a decrease in demand, it will shift to the left and the equilibrium price will decrease. Does that make sense? And if you're unsure about that, again, I would draw it out, okay? If you're drawing a chart about demand, then you're just drawing one supply line, and then you're having your demand lines. If you're drawing a chart for supply, you'll have one demand line, and then change your supply lines. Okay? And that's it. Any questions?
Most of the time, the U.S. isn't in equilibrium price, correct?
It's fluid. It's changing quite a bit because of all those factors. But that's ideal. That's like perfect competition, essentially, but that's like when everyone's happy. The suppliers are happy and the buyers are happy, is that equilibrium price.
And
But
inflation affects this as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Alright, so we have time right now. We would like you to take a look at your notes. Study your notes, make sure you have a good understanding of them. Yeah, you can look at your annotations, and then when we come back next period is when you'll take your quiz. Okay?
No way.
Does increasing demand shift right?
I like more.
It's just right.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
I don't know why I love that. I always draw.
Yep.
Did you see my